pray that this recording will work, because the last one didn't, and I was very upset about that. I think the problem was that I forgot to turn it off at the end, and the thing just got lost in the ether. In any event, we are now recording, and I'll turn it over to Josh. We'll have our usual sort of format where Josh will speak for 30, 40 minutes, whatever he feels he needs, and we'll take up the rest of the time with question and answers from the participants. So over to you, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And thanks very much for the opportunity to be here with you all. I'm really delighted to make these new connections, and delighted that Sam's and my work has engaged people's thinking to the extent that you felt it was worth reaching out. That's really very heartening to know.
For sure.
So I will speak to the ideas that we were looking at in the paper, and I think you have a link to it there in the information for this evening, and it really goes into all the detail that you would need. I'll draw out some key points, but I really would like to make this as interactive as possible, and call on you to please stop me, ask questions, and let's really use the time like that, in that way, rather than me just sort of talking at you for 30 minutes or so. I thought I might just say a little.
Josh, if I could just interrupt for a sec, if just to be able to organize questions and so on, if people would like to put any comments or questions into the chat area as things go along, I'll try to take note of that and then sort of lump them together and try to get them to some sort of order. Okay, sorry for the interruption, Josh. I forgot to do that before.
No, that's okay. That's great, Jack. Thank you. Thanks for your terrific moderation of things. I thought I might just start with a little bit of history around how I first encountered TEQs, or tradable energy quota systems, as a policy instrument. It was initially through encountering David Fleming's work, his book Lean Logic. And could I just check, for those here, are you familiar with David Fleming's book Lean Logic? Is that something you'd seen? Yeah.
Some of us would be and some aren't, yeah.
I was really quite, when I first learned of his work, I guess around 2015 or 2016, shortly before that book was published, I'd never heard of him before or his work, much to my discredit. I think because he's been doing some really important work for a long, long time, right up to his death around 2010 or 2011, I think it was. But that work really struck me as the breadth of it, and the extent, the integration of his thinking around this subject of economic de-intensification through lean principles as effectively a way of thinking about energy and economic descent. I hadn't ever encountered anything like it. It is magnificent in its scope, but so well integrated, and yet it's not about imposing a prescriptive set of ideas on the problem, or saying that you must accept my definition of the situation we're in. So really, it really made an impression on me, and I've drawn on that work in the years since quite frequently. So it was via David's work that I first encountered this idea of tradable energy quotas. And the thing that struck me is here was a very practical idea that had obviously been developed in really a lot of detail as a policy instrument. And this was, to my mind, rare in the sort of circles that I think we often work in. There's a lot of analysis of the problems, and but there's often not a lot of concrete thinking around really detailed approaches to how we actually deal with this. David Fleming is someone who has really looked at that very closely over a lifetime, and that made an impression. So I first started looking at tradable energy quotas in a little bit more detail around about 2017, when I was going to be speaking at an event with Richard Heinberg. Richard was going to be speaking by video. It was at the Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne. You might know about that. It's been going for, I guess, almost 20 years now, maybe even 20 years. I was speaking at a big event there, and Richard Heinberg was speaking by video. And the question for this session was, how do we transition to a renewable society? And I looked at that question and I saw the how there, and I thought, I'm going to have people in that audience who are going to want something concrete. They're going to want me to be able to point to something really specific, and they should do that. I thought, well, what have I got in my toolkit that I can draw on here that might fit the bill, that I can use to present people with something concrete that they can sink their teeth into if they want to go away and research it further and look it up further, at the same time as providing me with a stepping off point for really going into some of the I think, very important themes around the sort of cultural and social changes that the circumstances that we now find ourselves in globally portend. And so I recalled tradable economic quotas, and I thought, oh, maybe there's something in that. I'll go and have a bit of a closer look. And sure enough, as I started reading up on the background to it more closely, it connected in directly with the themes that I wanted to bring out at that presentation, which were first and foremost about the idea that if we are going to address these challenges that we are faced with, we are going to need to do this in a way that engages everyone, that gets away from this idea that this is the problems we face, the challenges we face, are challenges for our established formal institutions of governance to deal with, and everyone else can just go about their business. That sort of idea is, to my mind, completely antithetical to the situation that we're in. And at its heart, I see this as something that needs to engage all of us. And when I say all of us, it needs all of us in number and all of our being, if you like. And I saw that here was a policy instrument that had been presented to the UK Parliament. Turns out there'd been a UK Parliamentary Commission that had examined this in detail, assessed it, written up a big report on its suitability, had found it to be credible, technically sound, and yet had decided not to proceed with doing anything with it. This was, I think, more than 10 years ago now. They'd done this, and yet it also connected in with this much bigger theme. So I think, as an introduction to TEQ's tradable energy quotas and what it is, there's really no better starting point than that. It is a policy instrument that has been developed in depth, the purpose of which is to engage all citizens in the task of emissions reduction. Now, there is a really top-tier criterion that needs to be met before we can have any conversation about tradable energy quotas and what it is, what it's about. And that is that there's no conversation to be had unless a nation has agreed to put a hard cap on its emission budget, to set a hard emission budget, and put a firm cap on that, not just as a basic principle, but then to actually do something about that. and stick to it.
Look, I'm on a seminar right now, which I'd like to listen to. Can I call you back later? Okay, thanks.
So I think it's worth highlighting that we're talking here not about something that can preempt that conversation about setting a fixed emission budget, but this is something that comes into the conversation once there is resolve at the national level in relation to that. And following that, once there is resolve, to actually take that seriously and stick by it, and bring that to fruition. So the tradable energy quota system involves taking that agreed emission budget and allocating a set of emission units or quota of units to every adult, to freely issue these to every adult, and to set a budget on an annual basis that reduces over time until the full budget that has been agreed at the national level has been used up. So units are issued at the start of if a tax program was introduced, a policy was introduced, units would be issued to every adult in that nation. There'd be an annual number of units established for the first year, and then a proportion of those would be issued into accounts held by each adult on a weekly basis. And any time that a person purchases energy, that is, makes any purchase of fuels or electricity, they would be required to relinquish, to give up, to hand over tax units equivalent to the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for that energy that they are purchasing. So if I'm going to a petrol station to fill up my car with petrol, the petrol that I buy will be rated in terms of its life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And I buy, say, 10 litres of fuel. The life cycle emissions for that will be so many kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. I will therefore, in order to be able to purchase that 10 litres of petrol, need to relinquish the corresponding number of units from my account. If I don't have them, I have the option to purchase some more at the point of sale. If I don't want to do that, then I don't buy the fuel. It's as straightforward as that. Now, businesses, government entities, non-government organisations, any incorporated entities also are required to participate in the scheme. So any purchase of energy within that nation will involve relinquishing or handing over tax units. However, individuals have those units freely issued to them. Incorporated entities and government entities need to purchase them in a weekly tender in order to have units available to relinquish when they purchase energy. Now, really, I think important point here is that it covers all energy sources. So if I'm purchasing biodiesel, for instance, this will also have a carbon dioxide emission equivalent profile assigned to it, taking into account, of course, the fossil fuel emissions involved in the life cycle for production of biofuels. Similarly with renewably generated electricity. So it covers all energy. Now, the thinking around applying it to energy takes into account the fundamental role of energy in all economic activity. That energy as the capacity to do work or to essentially affect physical change is at the heart of all economic activity. Therefore, to the extent that energy use is damaging to the climate system, any energy use, any economic activity is going to involve energy use, is therefore going to impact on the climate in proportion to the fossil fuel proportion in that energy use, and therefore drive that down, and you drive down all of the adverse impacts associated with that economic activity via energy use, as distinct from related schemes that have been conceived where you would include every product and service within the economy under such a scheme. That is where, let's say I buy a kilogram of dishwashing powder, of laundry powder, that's going to have an emission profile associated with it, and I've got to hand over emission units equivalent to that kilogram of laundry powder. So TEX is different to that. It doesn't go down to that level of products and services. It focuses specifically on energy, but with the understanding that it is energy that is fundamental to all economic activity. If you drive down the fossil fuel or the emission profile of energy use, then you do that flows through to the entire economy. I might pause there and just see how everyone's going with the ideas. Just before I do that, my paper that was linked with the invite has a couple of paragraphs introduction to the text system, which fleshes out a few other minor details, but I would really recommend having a look at that as a first port of call, and from there looking at the Fleming Policy Centre website, which has a really terrific range of resources, giving you as much detail as you could possibly want on text, but also very succinct introductions to it, and a really terrific frequently asked questions type page there that really I think addresses a lot of the questions, the full spectrum of questions that have been asked over a long period of time in relation to how this would work in practice, what it isn't, and addressing sort of critiques and so forth. So I think that's, for anyone who really wants to drill down into the details, that's really the best way to get hold of it. But that summary in Sam's and my paper is probably not a bad sort of first port of call as well, although you'll find similar in sort of high-level introductions on the Fleming Policy website, Policy Centre website.
Hey, Josh, before we take questions on the tech, I wonder if you could just speak briefly about energy descent. It's a concept that some of us are quite familiar with, but I'm not sure that everyone is, and your paper does a really nice summary of why it's important and the role it plays in risk management for our civilization. So
okay, great. Sorry, I was going to head into that after just checking in on these details, but that's great. We'll do that, and I think it's worth doing. It's worth saying that the Tradable Energy Quota system was first proposed in the context of David Fleming's understanding of the I think in his view, probably the essentially the certainty of eventual energy descent. Certainly, in the terms that Sam and I put it in, the very high plausibility of that. We tend to put it in these terms, and I'll say a little bit more about what energy descent is in a moment. Sam and I tend to talk about it in terms of plausibility because we want to encourage people to entertain the idea, even if it is abhorrent to them, and completely contrary to any sort of understanding they have of the futures that are before us. So we tend to introduce it in that way. We ask people to entertain it as a plausibility on the basis of the case that we make for it. And at least by doing that, to have engaged with the ideas and considered them and perhaps have them in mind as something that they might allow, at the very least, they might hold in mind as something there that they may have to come to terms with. So it's a foot in the door. But energy descent is the idea that as a consequence of either responding to the climate situation by reducing emissions from fossil fuels, particularly in relation to energy use, that it will not be possible to do that while maintaining the same level or scale and extent of energy services that we are currently accustomed to. So energy descent is the idea that economies, one way or another, if we are going to address the climate situation, will need to very plausibly cope with fewer and different energy service availability. So energy services of reduced scope and energy services potentially of a different nature. For instance, electricity generated by variable renewable sources, wind and PV, is qualitatively different to electricity generated from rotating turbines, whether they be rotated by hydro turbines or steam turbines. That electricity is qualitatively different. Therefore, to the extent that we're going to be relying more on electricity from variable sources, we may well be needing to come to terms with electricity that is qualitatively different, effectively of a different nature in terms of its availability and reliability compared to what we are accustomed to now. Now, the other side of this is that the global energy system at the moment is dependent on primary energy sources that are subject to depletion, whether that be fossil fuels or nuclear electricity. These primary sources of energy are subject to depletion one way or another. They are a one-time windfall. Therefore, our economies are going to have to learn to do without them on some timeline, whether you see that as a 10-year issue or a 100-year issue or even a 500-year issue. This is something that humanity is going to have to come to terms with. And even on a 500-year timeline, well, cast back 500 years and look at what's happened over that period, it's really not a very long, it's a very, very long time for an individual, but for societies, it's not such a long time frame. So one way or another, we are going to be dealing with the consequences of constrained fossil fuel energy use. Fossil fuels have very particular characteristics that our economic systems now are very, very strongly dependent upon. Air travel is a perfect example of this. It really is only possible to do what we do with passenger and cargo air transport in the context of cheap and abundant, at least at the point of access. If we overlook the externalities, cheap and abundant petroleum-based fuels. So energy descent is the idea that in dealing with the consequences of that dependence on fossil fuel, coming to terms with that in a very serious way, and actually addressing these issues that our economies may very plausibly need to be able to cope with, to operate with less energy of qualitatively different characteristics. Jack, how is that as an introduction?
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful, Josh. And I wonder if you could also say a little bit about Joseph Taitner's view of the role of complexity in society and how that relates to the energy picture that you've just outlined.
So Joseph Tainter is most well known for his seminal work published around, I think it was in 1988 originally, The Collapse of Complex Societies. Tainter looked at past societies, past large-scale societies, civic societies, and what happened to them in the course of their development, and then their very, very frequent in the past demise, and was interested in the question of is there a common mechanism that can be identified in the collapse of past complex societies? And what he meant by a complex society was a society with significant role differentiation and then coordination mechanisms to then coordinate those highly differentiated social roles. What he hypothesized on the basis of his research was that complexity develops, that is, this proliferation in roles, greater diversity of social and economic roles, and increase in the mechanisms for coordinating those roles, that this proceeds in response to challenges, problems that societies face. And societies face problems, and the inevitable response is to solve those problems through creating new capabilities that inevitably involve new social roles being created and the need for new coordination of those social roles within the context of the existing society. And that in doing so, there are inevitable energy costs. So let's say we're talking about a largely agrarian society that needs to develop new irrigation works in order to support its crop growing, perhaps due to a change in local climate circumstances or the occurrence of a never before seen drought, perhaps. And so this society faces a crisis, a problem associated with being able to irrigate the crops that it has under cultivation. They direct more effort towards developing their irrigation works. That means people being employed in irrigation works as distinct from what it was that they were doing previously. And there are therefore costs associated with that. Those people who are doing that work now, doing this work that didn't have to be done in the past, need to be fed as well. The society as a whole needs to be able to bear that cost. And in the distant past, that was in the form of being able to feed those people. So there is an energy cost associated with that food. More food needs to be, you've got fewer people able to produce the food. Let's say more mouths that need to be fed by those who are producing it. You've got an additional energy cost. Where are you going to find that? So that energy cost needs to be met But I guess a very important insight from Tainter was that societies will solve problems and then they will find the energy resources to pay the costs of that afterwards. Societies in general do not say, okay, we've got a problem, we better do a cost benefit analysis on whether we can actually afford energetically and in terms of other resources to solve that problem, and then we'll decide whether we're going to solve that problem or not. The general course is that problem arises, people will do whatever they can to address that immediate problem within the means available to them, and in the course of doing that, end up using more energy resources. And of course, they can only do that if they have the means available. If they don't, then the problem doesn't get solved. And that's where you start running into problems with diminishing returns on investment in complexity, diminishing marginal returns initially, that can with time become diminishing absolute returns. And at that point, it's costing you more to solve problems than you can afford, and either by choice or by force of circumstance, complexity, complex socio-political institutions need to be abandoned in order for that society to continue in some form. That means going in the other direction, reducing complexity, and therefore not solving those problems, effectively becoming a different society as a result. Model of the course of complex societies is, well, it seems to be fairly well historically substantiated. Is it the only course? Do things necessarily need to go in that direction? Or do we have greater scope for choosing to arrange our societies in a way that, or to put it another way, to confront the problems with which we're faced in ways that don't require us to be finding further energy resources? That's a question that we're very interested in, and we think that TEQ's the Tradable Energy Quota system presents a really interesting opportunity in this respect. Complex societies tend not to go in the direction of choosing to simplify, because that means accepting ways of life, life conditions that are perceived as less advantageous, less beneficial than those they replace. Now, whether or not that is in fact the case, that reducing socio-political complexity will lead to disadvantageous conditions, is really up for grabs. There's a significant and growing body of research in relation to conditions around the formation of the earliest states, the earliest sort of large-scale, socio-politically complex civic societies, that says people didn't go in that direction because it was providing them with real benefits. That it was that people went in that direction reluctantly. James Scott's book Against the Grain, if you've come across it, is very interesting in this respect, and well worth a look. So there's sort of an emerging picture that says, well, A, that the dark ages that often followed, well, that inevitably follow the breakdown of complex societies that have written historical records, dark ages take their name from the fact that there's relatively little written historical records of those periods. Once complex societies that have written histories go away, very often written historical records go away as well, and that you don't hear much about what was happening in that intervening period. Does that mean that that intervening period was a period where people were not living well? Well, that's traditionally been the assumption from the West, the point of view of the West, but this is increasingly up for grabs. And we think there's some interesting opportunities in this to consider other approaches to dealing with our collective problems that we face, whereby giving up some of the apparent gains of our very now extremely complex societies in this, using the term complex in Tainter's sociological sense, of increased role differentiation and the need for increasingly sophisticated coordination governance mechanisms. We wonder, we feel we have reason to think that there are opportunities for finding ways of living well, in fact, in many respects, better than we're living at present, by de-intensifying our economies, finding ways of organising more informally, and doing away with some of these institutional structures that we've traditionally come up with as responses to our problems, or at least taking a path that goes in a different direction. Now, how does text come into this? The Tradable Energy Quota system. At the moment, there is essentially no possibility that in liberal democracies, people will, on a large scale, choose to voluntarily simplify and to de-intensify our economies. The cultural narratives around what it means to live well and be a successful society are so deeply ingrained that it's very difficult to see that this could be anything other than a fringe conversation amongst thoughtful, open-minded people, in the absence of collectively agreed mechanisms that allow us to discover the limits of the green growth type approach to dealing with our environmental challenges. We are not going to convince people that there's a need to go down this sort of path until people are actually confronted with a circumstance where they have less in the way of energy services available to them. Now, if people find themselves in circumstances where they have fewer energy services and lower quality energy services available to them, it's very likely that people will openly explore these sorts of ideas around voluntary simplification as a path to de-intensifying economies. But you first have to get people to go along on a path where that can be discovered, not because they're forced to do that or asked to do that up front, but as a consequence of addressing the climate dilemma. So the Tradable Energy Quota system is it doesn't matter how the emissions from energy use are reduced. If they are reduced via substituting fossil fuel energy use with lower carbon forms of energy, from the tech's perspective, that is just as good as demand management approaches, that is, getting by with less. At the same time, if we choose to get by with less, the tech system does its work as well. So if we can collectively agree that we need to cap our emissions and say, okay, yep, we're going to do that and we're going to commit to that path. We're not going to stray from that path. And we're going to do that by rationing the emissions that are available to us. If we use up our ration, then we're not going to use any more. Then we say, okay, great. And then that's going to give us an incentive to go as hard as possible on decarbonising our energy systems through substitution of lower carbon energy sources, whether they be renewable energy or nuclear energy in places where nuclear energy is deemed socially and politically acceptable or is already in place, such as France. Whether it be that or natural gas, if indeed it can be demonstrated that natural gas provides a net benefit, at least in the short term. Of course, eventually it's got to go. But in the early stages, it might be that people can demonstrate that natural gas over its life cycle is sufficiently lower in carbon that it's going to be helpful. We go down that path. But as the carbon budget is used up, the annual units that are being issued to the nation are contracting, and that task of supplanting fossil fuel energy use with lower carbon forms becomes harder and harder. Initially, you've got a lot of low-hanging fruit. You're going to use that up early on, and the task is going to get progressively harder. Now, if it turns out that technological progress is such that renewable energy outperforms the sort of expectations that we have for it, or it performs, let's say, put this differently, if it performs according to some of the most optimistic projections, then all well and good to an extent. Because, of course, energy use, whether it be fossil fuel based or renewably based, has impacts on the biosphere that go beyond the climate impacts. So even if we are wildly successful in replacing fossil fuel energy use with lower carbon energy use, even if we're wildly successful in getting to 100% renewably powered economies, and we have abundant renewably powered electricity, renewably sourced electricity and fuels available to us, we are going to be impacting on the biosphere in all sorts of ways that are going to impinge on other limits. Okay, so if we are successful in this, so TEX provides us with a framework where we can find this out. It's effectively could provide us with a collective contract of discovery around these questions, if you like. However, if we're not able to do that, if we find that we simply can't keep up the same level of energy service access that we are accustomed to at the moment with lower and lower carbon sources, and we are steadfastly committed to sticking to that emission budget, well, the only pathway that we have to go down is reducing our demand, both in terms of the nature and scale of the energy that we use. And at that point, questions about, or the conversation about voluntary simplification, energy descent, becomes one that's much more likely to engage a far greater proportion of the population, and much more likely to be of interest to people, because of course people are going to continue to want to find ways of living comfortably. If getting by with less intensive energy use, with economies that are less dependent on intensive energy use, provides us with avenues for living in contented lives, then at that point we may have that conversation. So it's on that basis that we say TEX is a really interesting proposal, because it doesn't require us to look at that question up front, but it provides us with a context where, should it be necessary, there's a straightforward, well, we think a relatively straightforward transition over to a very broad public conversation about that topic. And that might be a good place at which to wrap on the detail.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Josh. And also thanks for demonstrating that you don't need a PowerPoint to get a lot of important, interesting ideas across. Okay, we've got a few questions here, and I'm just wondering if the first questions we might take are ones that have to do with just how the tech system works. And then we can, once we're all address those issues, we can then move on to some of the implications about implementation and so on.
Terrific.
All the questions we have so far, I think, are more along the lines of how do we do it, and some of the implications are. So I think we can assume then that people are understanding the tech system. They don't have any additional questions. And as you said, there's an excellent website providing lots of details for people to look at. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here from Deirdre. Do we have to completely abandon our ETS, the New Zealand's emissions trading system, and how is this feasible? Well, I don't know whether you're familiar with our system, Josh, but if you have any comments on that, or perhaps some of the other participants would like to make a comment about it, but I'll give Josh the first opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's this question of whether a tradable energy quota system could be compatible with an existing ETS system that's in place is one that I think has come up in the past, and I believe that the Fleming Policy Centre has addressed this. In fact, I think Sean Chamberlain, I'm not sure if everyone who's present would be aware of Deirdre's blog post on TEX a week or so back, or maybe 2 weeks back now. Deirdre put a very good introductory post up on that, and Sean Chamberlain, who is the executive director, I think, of the Fleming Policy Centre, actually responded with a comment to that, and I believe that he may have put up a link there on the question of that provides some information on that question of whether a TEX system can be made compatible with an existing ETS. So my understanding of that is so Jack and I exchanged some thoughts about this a few weeks back, and I tentatively initially thought that there might be some scope for that. I think I was probably poorly informed in my thinking around that, based on having a look at what the Fleming Policy Centre has to say on that and the thinking that they've done around it. I think it's very unlikely that a TEX system could work in parallel with an existing ETS, simply because it would mean that you would be effectively having to, or entities that were subject to both systems would be having to make commitments in two separate systems related to their energy use, or the emissions related to their energy use. So it does seem to me that it really is something that could only work effectively if it was the sole approach to doing this. The question then is, if a tax system was received sufficient support and there was an ETS in place already, then how would you deal with that? And I guess there may be ways of looking at a transition over whereby the commitments under the existing ETS would be rolled into a more comprehensive tax system. But, you know, I'm really starting to speak outside of my areas of expertise now. You know, and so I think I would refer you in the first instance to the Fleming Policy Centre on a question of that nature. But my understanding is that it would be very challenging to try to implement this something like this on top of an existing ETS.
Yeah, I have a comment about that, but before I make it, I'd like to give anyone else who has something to say on this issue of whether the tax system and an ETS could work together in New Zealand in particular. Does anyone have a comment on that? That's different from what Josh has suggested?
Well, there'd be two different prices. That's the problem for the units.
Yeah.
That's what the Fleming Policy Centre said.
Yeah, I've seen that. But what is not clear to me is that in New Zealand, for example, we have about half of our emissions are from fossil fuels and half are biogenic, largely from agriculture. And if we had a tax system for fossil fuels as it was originally developed only, and had a separate system, perhaps an ETS or perhaps even a tax system for biogenic emissions, does it really matter? I mean, for example, if I'm a farmer, I would still have to buy energy quotas to run my tractor and my truck and so on. But I would also have responsibility for biogenic emissions that I would either deal with, again, through the ETS or through a tradable emissions system. And it's not clear to me that they would be incompatible.
No, that's a very good.
At least on a theoretical basis. I'm just turning my video off because I have a bandwidth problem, just FYI.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that goes to the detail of what's included in the ETS. My understanding is that if the ETS was dealing exclusively with emissions that were, or if the tax system and was dealing entirely with energy-related emissions, and then the ETS was dealing with emissions that were not energy-related, in principle, it seems that they would be compatible. I think I would go back to that initial point that I made about that basic design principle with TECs, that it's founded on the understanding that if you deal with the energy, then that has flow-through consequences for all economic activity. Hence the reason for focusing there, and then not the least, dealing with that particular issue is of such scale and urgency that I think, I'd be interested in the conversation, but I think even in New Zealand's case, surely there would be, or in New Zealand's situation, there would surely be a case for, a strong case for dealing with fossil fuel emissions being a higher priority than biogenic. Now, I might just say in relation to that, though, that when I use the term biogenic, I'm thinking of emissions that are of a biospheric origin, not the broader category of farm-based emissions. So farm-based emissions include emissions associated with fertilizer use and fuel use on farms, but the origins of the carbon from those emissions is fossil, not biogenic. And certainly within the formal institutional arrangements for looking at national emissions, there are clear differentiations made between emissions of fossil origin and emissions of biogenic origin in terms of the role that they play in the carbon cycle. So, you know, and certainly the emissions of a fossil origin that are much more important in that respect, we need to limit the aggregate amount of carbon that is going from fossil geosequestration into the atmosphere, as distinct from, you know, as a priority over dealing with relative rates of circulation of carbon once it's in the biospheric carbon cycle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to move on to some other questions here. Dougal has asked, could you implement a tech as a nation without undermining economic competitiveness? What are the implications for a tech system and a nation like New Zealand, again, that has extensive trade as part of their economy?
Well,
International.
I think the implications of a tech system are that the economy will be getting by with less and less fossil fuel energy use. And if that energy use can be supplanted by lower carbon sources, renewable sources, at the same scale and with the same quality, and if that doesn't constrain existing economic activity or its trajectory of growth, if it doesn't constrain the products that a nation produces and trades, then its economic competitiveness will be unaffected. I think it's very unlikely, though, that would be the case. If any nation that was serious about reducing its fossil fuel energy use, that does so, that goes about that more aggressively than its trading partners, is going to find itself almost certainly at a disadvantage. Now, maybe I'll be found. Maybe my concerns in relation to that will be discovered to be unfounded, and we'll find that it's very straightforward transitioning over to 100% renewably powered economies and having all the electricity and fuels that we could ever possibly want. Maybe I'll be found to be wrong in my concerns. I've spent 20 years looking at this question. I've read pretty much all of the studies, the optimistic energy balance studies from the big academic research groups that do work in this and tell us that it's all going to be a straightforward matter if we can just get the political obstacles out of the way. And I'm afraid, as someone with a mechanical engineering background, who is equipped to look at this work, and make a fairly good assessment of it, what I see is the same work going on again and again and again, year after year, not addressing the questions that would need to be addressed really in order to get to grips with this question, and telling us that everything is going to be okay on the basis of effectively the same process, the same very superficial process of feasibility evaluation. Now, it's not to say that that work that's going on around that isn't important. It is an important first step, but it's a first step. And, you know, there are very confident pronouncements made about how straightforward it is going to be to supplant fossil fuel energy use with renewables that simply don't rest on adequate foundations. And I refer anyone who's interested in the background to that, to my broader body of work, including my book from last year with Graham Palmer on energy storage. If you have a look at my website, Beyond This Brief Anomaly, you'll find references to my work in this area, summarising or drawing together a very large body of work from other serious researchers in this area, who you don't hear as much from because they don't have the good news story to tell that people like Mark Jacobson have had to tell in the past. I mentioned Mark Jacobson's name just because he's probably the most prominent of the very bullish researchers on the prospects for renewable energy, 100% renewable energy transition. I'd love it if they were right, except for the problem about what we do to all of our other, without respect to our other biosphere limits, if we have that unlimited physical power available to us. I don't think we humans have a very good record with having effectively unlimited physical power put in our hands. So I'm not sure that it's going to make a great difference if that unlimited physical power is zero carbon or not.
Okay, another question from Deirdre here about the effects of a tax system on the share market, and pointing out that a lot of retirees rely on income from shares. How would the share market be affected?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think implement a tax system, and what you're saying is we're really prepared to do this. We're going to get by with less fossil fuel energy use one way or another. We have a share market that at the moment is just propped up with speculative air. Really, I mean, valuations of companies are based on hopes that something's going to happen almost magically. It's going to come home to roost one way or another. Implementing a tax system would be a good way of bringing forward that day of reckoning. But I don't expect that it's going to be particularly good for retirees or any of the rest of us. We'll find out, though. I mean, it's a good way to find out.
Another question, I think, from Gray. What's the role of society and their collective capability of addressing issues and exploring most effective ways of resolving their common problems?
Could you read that just one more time, Jack? Yeah, I'd just like to.
Yeah, I will, but you might be able to see it in the chat yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, of course. Let me just get that up. Okay.
Yes, I think he's asking, what's the role of society? In other words, what collectively, do we really have the capability of addressing these issues and exploring effective ways of resolving these common problems that we have, that most of us aren't even aware of?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that seems to me to be no. I mean, we have a massive governance issue. We have we're really good. Capitalism, Western sort of democracies are very, very good at unleashing creative ideas but we've got a horrible track record of reining them in once we discover what their second order co-effects are. I mean, we just don't have, we're not constituted to be able to do that, it seems.
Or perhaps it has to do with the level of complexity we've reached.
Yeah, I mean, doing otherwise would mean effectively implementing, some form of the precautionary principle. That is, not doing certain things, holding back on doing things that we can do because of concerns about what the outcomes might be.
Well, I'd like to point out that the Climate Commission is a direct result of civil society initiatives, particularly the role of Generation Zero, but a number of other initiatives. And there's, Jack is involved in a local process which has got an enormous amount of energy behind developing local solutions. And I'm trying to develop the same sort of thing in the Bay of Plenty in Tauranga here. It's strange, it's an aspect which is almost completely ignored in the bureaucratic, in the official documentation and in the Climate Commission advice. The evidence is that historical evidence is that there are a lot of community changes which have developed from community initiatives.
Gray, your question brings to mind for me the role that citizens' assemblies might play in dealing with these kinds of issues, if people are familiar with that concept. But we won't go off to that. But Andrew had a question here that has to do with the mechanics of TECs. Can you provide any comment on the split of free allocations provided to individuals compared to those quotas that need to be purchased by businesses or governments or other entities?
Yeah, in the UK, so TECs has been developed in detail in the UK context specifically. So wherever you see any detailed description of how it would be implemented, it's based on the UK context specifically. But their approach was to allocate 40% to individuals, being the proportion of emissions associated with household energy use. So 40% to individuals and the remainder available for purchase by incorporated entities and government entities.
Do you have any views or comments on applying that elsewhere? Like in New Zealand, it's probably going to be a different split based on that criteria. Then I guess that's a good criteria, or any views on that?
I would, on a question of that nature, I would defer entirely to the Fleming Policy Centre. The work that, I'm an interested observer of it relative to the work that they've done in its development. I can think of no reason to take a different approach on that. If I heard an argument otherwise, I'd be absolutely open to considering it. But it seems to me to be a pretty sound basis, and I think it would probably perhaps then be a matter of looking at you would look at the national context where you were considering implementing it. What proportion of New Zealand's emissions from energy use are at the household level, and then allocating it accordingly seems reasonable. But I think if New Zealand was if there was a proposal to develop a New Zealand specific text design, at that point I'd be going to the Fleming Policy Centre and saying, hey, this is what we're proposing to do. What do you reckon?
Yeah, Deirdre has a follow-up question here. It says if businesses have to pay for quotas at auction, that means the price of energy-intensive goods would rise. And would that be inflationary?
It would be inflationary if the money supply was greater than the goods and services available to purchase with it. So, I mean, it would be inflationary in the same way that that inflation is a relationship with money supply anywhere, I would imagine. It's certainly, I mean, yes, good energy-intensive goods and services will increase in price, but that then creates an incentive to meet equivalent needs by lower cost means. It doesnmore necessarily mean that, I mean, it's inflationary if people feel compelled to pay those to buy those more expensive goods and services. If people are able to find alternatives that satisfy their needs adequately, then it won't be inflationary, I guess. And it will be inflationary in the first instance to the extent that the money supply is there to pursue that. But I'm going to actually, this is being recorded, and I'm not an economist, and I should probably shut up at this point and bow out.
Sorry.
To anyone who is to any economists in the audience, either at the moment or watching the recording, if I have misspoken, I am absolutely willing to accept that, and I apologise.
No worries, Josh. That's a good qualifier. But of course, we also have central bank regulations to help with inflation as well. Dougal has another question here about net energy analysis, or EROEI. He's specifically asking about the situation in Australia and to what degree there's discussion about decline in net energy availability, and with several people like Charlie Hall and Josh Farley and Nate Higgins and so on arguing that it's likely to be happening sooner rather than later in terms of its impact on not only emissions but economic growth. Is there much discussion outside of the Institute and the Simplicity Institute and your group about this in Australia?
No, not particularly. Only, prominent economists saying, well, and researchers in the renewable energy area often seeking to discredit the energy return on investment metric at all. It often arouses people's suspicions. They hear reference to it and think that you must be using it to tear down renewables. And so some of the most prominent work on it here that I've seen in recent times has been to that effect, to say you don't need to worry about such questions in relation to renewables. Renewables have high ROI, so don't worry about it. All we need to do is accelerate the transition to renewable energy, and then no one needs to worry about such questions. So no, not particularly. That's to the extent, as I say, to the extent that there is a conversation, it's one of, well, if it's an issue, just more reason to accelerate the transition to renewables.
Yeah, your paper with Sam addresses this to an extent where you talk about your other paper that you did together on energy humility and its role in risk management. I wonder if you could make a comment about that.
Yeah, epistemic humility or not, or
Yeah,
knowledge
that's right.
humility. So, I mean, this goes back to the comments that I made earlier about the very high-profile feasibility studies on the transition to 100% renewable energy, and not just on that, I might add. Very large-scale computer-based studies on the prospects for green growth, for instance. There's a lot of work that goes on in this sort of area, very, very high level abstract computer-based studies that says that we're going to be able to do such and such, and we can be confident of that. Our call is for bringing some more humility to the way that we interpret the findings from such studies, knowing that they're not based on concrete historical experience. They're based on rafts and rafts of assumptions about how the world might work under very different circumstances to the circumstances that we're historically familiar with. Given that, we might want to express a little more uncertainty with respect to what the results of those studies imply. This stuff, it's hardly controversial. It seems hardly controversial when you say it like this, and yet people hate me saying this sort of thing. And I think over the years I know a little bit more about why that is. When I say this, I'm really challenging the foundations of our entire cultural edifice. I mean, modernity is based on the assumption of greater and greater certainty and control, greater and greater control over our circumstances. And if we're not able to create sort of abstract conceptual models of how the world works that are going to deliver us greater and greater certainty about the future, then what does that say about the entire project of modernity? I think what it says is that in many respects, we've been misguided in the confidence that we've placed in our conventional knowledge institutions. It's not to say that they're not extremely powerful and extremely valuable and good at doing particular things. But if there's anything that we should have learned over the course of the last 400 or 500 years, it's that there are things that we just don't know, and there are things that we know that we don't know that we don't know. Everything that comes out of the incredible advances in human knowledge over that period of time, and in the instruments that we've devised for creating knowledge, everything that's come out of that has also come with lessons about what it is that we were not able to foresee. So should we expect that our economic systems will continue to function as they do now when we substitute in different foundational resources? So, I mean, what we know about the costs of renewable energy is all based on cost discovery in the context of a fossil-fueled economic system. So when we look at the declining levelized cost of electricity from PV and wind, very real declines in costs, no question about it. But when we look at those costs and then project them forward into worlds that are constituted in very different worlds, in very different ways to the world in which we've in which we've developed those cost projections, can we assume that things will continue on in the same way? I don't know that, you know, the modelling that we do can't answer that question itself. These are questions that lie outside the boundaries of our models. It's in relation to that issue that we suggest that we should be approaching these questions with greater epistemic humility. And as a result of that, in response to that, not throwing up our hands and saying, oh, well, what can we then do? But devising ways of moving forward that take into account the basic uncertainty that entails, which just means weighting our decisions differently, giving greater value to decisions that may remain robust, even if we're wrong about our expectations of how things might go. You know, this is where ideas around resilience and so forth start to, I guess, come in.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's a great paper, by the way, that I highly recommend to everyone on epistemic humility. It's yourself, and is it James again, or Sam?
Sam. Yeah, Sam is also an author. There's quite I think there were 8 or 9 of us who are co-authors on that. Some really quite prominent researchers in this area around energy transition and the relationship between energetics and society, who, even though there are differing views with respect to the prospects for such transition, agree that we need to be approaching these questions with a greater willingness to acknowledge the uncertainties entailed.
Yeah, that's a very good paper. And I think we have time for one more question. Dougal's question about, you mentioned that the UK government gave some serious consideration to the tech approach for a while and did quite a bit of research on it, and yet it was rejected. Can you speak to why that happened?
Well, I think, you know, I'd refer you on to the report. There was a report prepared on that's on the Fleming Policy website. So when I say it was rejected, I'm not sure if did I say that? Did I use that term specifically? They yeah, I may not. I may have. I may have been a bit loose with that. They acknowledged that it was sound. I think the sort of key finding was that they said it's really ahead of its time. We think we're going to be able to achieve a sufficient outcome without having to resort to such a strong mechanism. They thought they were going to be able to get to where they needed to get to with more conventional mechanisms that would be more comfortable to people, if you like, and that wouldn't hold them to such strong account. I think this was probably at a time. So the UK now has adopted a much stronger stance in relation to their emission budget, and I think this review was prior to that time. And I don't know if this has prompted a revisit of that. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't at this stage. But I also think that, you know, they were kidding themselves, of course, with respect to the adequacy of their existing mechanisms.
Yeah, and I think there was
in relation to their weaker objectives in the past.
Yeah, I think there was a further complication where they did a study of the tech system, but they modified it. And then because of the modifications, it really wasn't a tech system anymore. And so they rejected it on the basis of what they tested rather than the system as it should have been tried. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds it sounds familiar. So yeah, I think worth checking in on that report on the Fleming Policy website, which goes into that in detail. But I think that the key point is that there was in principle recognition that that as a policy instrument it was sound, fit for purpose.
I suspect they were scared that it would actually work.
Yeah, I suspect so too. I suspect that what that was the issue, was that they recognised that actually it would work, and the implications of that would be along the lines of some of those implications that we've discussed this evening.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's been really helpful, Josh. Does anyone have a last question they want to get in before we close the session?
Yeah, sorry, if I could pass on a question from Pat Scott. We were discussing it on emails, and she and someone else were concerned that the tax system would result in a transfer of wealth, or more of the same old problem where the powerful would be buying most of the tax, and you would get people sort of selling their soul really and sitting in freezing buildings, unable to heat them and so forth. You may have touched on that. I don't know, I've lost connection a couple of times, but yeah, have you got a comment on that, Josh?
Yeah, my understanding is that the tax policy instrument was specifically designed to address that concern. I believe that on the Fleming Policy website, there's under their frequently asked questions, there's a response to exactly that issue, I think. Yeah. But certainly the allocation of free quotas to each adult to cover household energy use is specifically intended to address that. And so anyone who finds ways of using less than their quota is then able to sell those additional units or those excess units through the market mechanism provided for that. And so anyone who's paying more to get access to those is doing so by a transfer of wealth back to those who are finding ways of using less.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll bring that to a close. Josh, thanks very much again for not just this evening, but for all the work and energy that you put into dealing with these very difficult and important issues that we're all concerned about, and actually being able to provide some very well thought out policy instruments that could actually make a difference if we could ever get enough support for them. So thanks very much, and thanks to those who participated and asked some really helpful questions, good questions. And I'm going to pause the recording now, stop the recording, and hopefully it'll be able to get it onto the website, the OCD website.